Welcome back to Simplifying the State, the podcast where we break down politics so you don't have to figure out why World War III is trending again on Google. As always, I'm Adam Watson.
And I'm Nicholas Perrin.
Okay, so Nicholas, what do Raytheon, Texas Instruments, and Boeing all have in common?
Are they all big parts of the military-industrial complex?
They are indeed. They're all three big companies that provide military equipment to the United States. That's right. The same people who make your calculator also make systems for missiles.
And I'm going to apply to all of them.
Okay. So that's basically what our episode is going to be about this week. We're going to be talking about the history of price gouging within the U.S. military and to a larger extent the military-industrial complex. And then towards the end, we're going to have a little debate about something. So stick around for that. Okay, but Nicholas, do you want to give us a quick kind of rundown on what the military-industrial complex is and kind of how it's evolved over time?
Yeah. So the military-industrial complex in the United States really started to, become a thing when the U.S. joined World War II. Before then, it was a mix of just civilian industry, and the U.S. had their own shipyards and weapons factories that they used in World War I and other wars. But during World War II, that's when the complex actually started to become a thing, with the pressure from FDR to put more civilian industry into military industry and have specified military wings of those civilian companies. So, for example, beforehand in weapons manufacturing in the United States, it was around 1% of GDP, but during the Second World War, it went up to 40%. And part of that was because of the spawn of the military-industrial complex and how much the U.S. manufactured during the Second World War. And following World War II, the industrial complex maintained and continued to make a lot of money because everyone thought World War III was imminent and the U.S. wanted to be prepared for that. And this is where it actually gained its name, which was coined by Eisenhower in his farewell address, in which he said the country to be cautious of the military-industrial complex for a number of reasons that we'll probably get to in the ending debate. And towards more modern times, from 1992 to 1997, there was a lot of incentive provided by the government to have the many companies in the military-industrial complexes to merge in order to cut costs, in theory. But that's kind of backfired, as a lot of the equipment that used to be very cheap is now, in some cases, thousands of percent more than they were just a couple decades ago, which is more than inflation would have caused.
Right.
And yeah, that's pretty much where we are today.
All right, yeah. So basically, I'm sure all of you know, the United States has a fairly large defense budget for the last couple of years. It's been somewhere in the neighborhood of between $700 and $800 billion. So obviously a very large percent of our GDP is spent on it. A large percent of our federal budget is spent on it. In the year 2026, the White House has submitted a proposal for a 1.01 trillion, that's trillion with a T, defense budget, which we have not seen a budget of that size since, I believe, the Cold War. And here's the reason it's fairly high. So in 2023, almost half of the budget went towards defense contractors. Now, this is for a litany of things, but a lot of it is for equipment, a lot of it is for parts, a lot of it is for software. A good example of this is the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter program. So basically, the U.S., in conjunction with a lot of our allies, especially NATO, Israel, Indonesia, Australia, Indo-Pacific allies such as those, have uh, gone to Lockheed Martin, and they have developed a new Joint Strike Fighter. So that basically means it's a jet that can accomplish various goals like air-to-air combat, air-to-ground combat, uh, air-to-sea combat, etc., etc. So basically, the U.S. owns the plane, or the country owns the plane, but in order to get software updates for the vast amount of sensors on board the aircraft, that's what makes it so advanced is its sensor suite, or in order to get replacement parts for the aircraft, or in order to get pilot training for the aircraft, they have to go to Lockheed Martin and then buy that from them. So they cannot make the parts themselves, and it's in the contract they signed with Lockheed Martin. So basically, the U.S. owns the plane, but Lockheed Martin owns all the technology and all the ability to essentially keep it running. So without Lockheed Martin, it's basically a shell, basically. And so that allows Lockheed Martin basically to charge whatever they want, given that they are the only ones who are allowed to create software for it or create replacement parts for it. Another good example of kind of how price gouging, Nicholas talked about the just scale to which the costs have skyrocketed for various things. In 1991, a single shoulder fire Stinger missile, which is a fairly useful air to ground to air combat missile, surface to air missile, cost about $25,000 in 1991. And since the mass consolidation of defense contractors from about 50 or so companies into 5 big companies, that cost has now gone to $400,000 since Raytheon is the sole supplier of that missile. So if just based off inflation, it would now equal about $55,000. So the amount that it has increased by is well beyond what the average rate of inflation has been since 1991, showing that Raytheon is basically charging whatever they want. And as a result, we have had to increase our defense budget to such a degree because we need those weapons. We need the replacement missiles for the system. We need replacement missiles for the Patriot defense system. And we need all of these things. And seeing as how there is very little competition left in the defense industry, they are just kind of able to charge whatever they want. Nicholas, what do you think about just kind of hearing that? Like, what do you think about just hearing about that just massive increase of the price well beyond what inflation is?
Well, obviously, it's a very bad thing for the federal government and for the defense of the United States in general. And it also affects the American taxpayer a lot. So really, if the government allows this to continue, there are 2 options which can happen. Either taxes go up and more people will get angry about that, or the government can spend the same amount of money but get less out of it. And so basically a soldier will have just that much less ammunition to use for their missions and to defend themselves with. Either option is bad, and it would be good to resolve this issue, to say the least.
Or there's a third option, which is they have to pull funding from other things like Social Security or Medicaid, which people need to survive. I mean, obviously, we need the military to kind of maintain a defense in our nation. But I mean, yeah, you're right. There are basically 3 options if this price gouging is allowed to continue. Basically, we we have to increase taxes. Nobody wants that. Nobody likes that. Option two is, we get less for our money, and we get less ammunition, like you said, for like a soldier on a battlefield. There was a pretty good example of this. There was an Apache helicopter. It needed a replacement part. The Pentagon then went to the company saying, hey, we can kind of make it ourselves. We just kind of need your permission because this is an active combat zone and they kind of need that helicopter. They said, no, you cannot do that. You have to pay us to send the part, and that helicopter doesn't go anywhere until you give us the money to then send you the spare part for the thing you bought. So this was not like something sitting on an air base in Kansas that, couldn't run for a little bit. This was an active piece of weaponry in an active combat zone where American troops were fighting that needed that air support, that the defense contractor was basically saying, you can't have this possibly life-saving piece of equipment until you give us the money to fix it for you, and we won't let you fix it yourself. Nicholas, what do you think of that and the potential impact that could have on a battlefield? I mean, obviously we're heading towards a more drone, autonomous centered kind of battle space now. Kind of what we've seen in Ukraine, it's kind of shown the future is kind of in drones, but I mean there's still use for the more practical, the more traditional, like man-powered or man-operated military equipment. But what do you think that could have an impact on future U.S. operations?
Well, obviously, it would make any kind of combat operation much more difficult and annoying. But to be honest, I think past a certain point, the soldiers on the ground would stop listening to that. And I mean, because they carry around spare parts sometimes, and there are a lot of spare parts. For example, of this one helicopter pin that they could use for that if the time comes, but they don't, because they don't want to violate the law during peacetime like that. But I think during wartime it would provide a lot more leniency, and yeah, in my opinion, I don't think it would cause that much difference in a more formal war, but in a proxy war today, then yeah, it would cause a lot of issues, and it's not a good thing to have.
Right, yeah, no, I could definitely see, if a war were to occur, you could see Congress passing a law, or the president maybe doing an executive order basically saying that those parts, exclusive rights to sell spare parts, to make spare parts, those are temporarily suspended until the war is over. I could definitely possibly see that happening. But yeah, like you said, if it's peacetime and it's not a large scale war, and we're doing, say, an operation in Syria or Somalia or something like that, then and if the troops are in an active combat zone and they need that spare part, but they can't violate the law, then they're kind of stuck in between a rock and a hard place. So, which could put their lives at risk. So the Inspector General for numerous Inspector Generals and various reports have found more instances of defense contractors regularly overcharging the military. For example, there was a finding of $71 for a pin that should have cost less than a nickel, and $80 for a drain pipe segment that should have cost $1.41. So, Nicholas, what do you think of these just insane markups that we're seeing going on within our military?
I mean, it's really just what happens in a monopoly. The government has no one else to buy it from, and they're contractually obligated to buy it from these companies. So even if they have some replacement parts that they could use, which they did, because I also read that report, this is really just what happens. The government really shot themselves in the foot back in the 90s by telling all the defense contractors to merge.
Yeah, I mean, when you have a capitalist society like America's, and you have a group of industries that are that supply such an essential thing for a nation like the military equipment, and then you have a monopoly and you combine that together, you're going to get instances like Lockheed Martin and Boeing charging, uh, making profits of around 40% for a um, missile, for a PAC-3 missile, and then, but I mean, there are countermeasures within the Pentagon that can help. There's like a specific office that kind of looks for stuff like this. And once they found that out, they negotiated a new contract, which saved American taxpayers about $550 million. Um, but then again, but then here's a few more instances just to kind of drive the point home, which is $4,361 for a half-inch metal pin, which was almost a 9,400% excess profit for that company. The Army was paying $1,678.61 for a small helicopter part each, which the Pentagon already had in stock for $7.71. And then TransDigm, a spare parts provider, pricing certain parts 4,000% higher than their manufacturing costs. I mean, it's what happens in a monopoly when you have a company that has, or companies that have such a large control over an industry. You're basically at their mercy unless you heavily regulate them, which, because of lobbying, the government doesn't really do. Okay, so we've kind of broken this down, and now we're going to have the debate which we talked about. So basically, the subject we're debating is whether or not the U.S. should nationalize its defense industry. So I am going to take the side of pro-nationalization. Nicholas is going to take the side of anti-nationalization, and we're just going to have a quick debate on the subject. So Nicholas, do you want to go first and issue your first kind of point to why you think the U.S. should not nationalize its defense industry?
Yeah, I can do that. So, one really, one benefit of having the current structure that we do, bar the now monopoly of, the sectors of production, is that competition will reign supreme, and historically speaking, there are more instances where competition by individuals who are under their quote unquote, more under their management than if they would be if they were working under the government, has shown to provide a more technological breakthrough and more what's the word, incentive to create their own things that will outcompete the other competitors.
Right. So I wouldn't necessarily push back on that. I do think that competition does breed innovation, but here's where I would maybe disagree in terms of how it pertains to the military. So I think you could make the argument that we should have a research sector that should be privatized, a sector where you get like specs or designs for different aircraft or different weapons for production or different missile systems. But I think then the issue that I have is when it comes to producing it, when it comes to creating it, when it comes to making it, when it comes to making the spare parts, that's where I think the government should kind of take a more proactive role and kind of nationalize the production part of the defense process. So I'd agree with you that one of the reasons that we have such advanced military technology is because of the kind of competition within the different companies which exist in a capitalist society. But then I think then we need to nationalize the production part to make sure that we can produce what we need at a price that is fair, and then make sure that we have it in the event of war. So, and then here's another point I'd make, which is that, well, an example rather. So basically, the U.S. Navy has about 490 so ships. These are active ships or ships that are being built. And if we stay on our current level of production, we are going to actually lose more ships as time goes on than we can build. One of the part of this is because of the fact that there are so few private shipbuilding sites in the U.S. So the fewer dockyards you have, the fewer ships you can produce. As a result, we are not producing enough ships to keep up with the rising level of retirements that is coming as the I wouldn't say largely Cold War, but I would say a lot of the designs are from the Cold War. Some of the ships are from the Cold War, but have been upgraded. But they're kind of starting to show their age, especially our aircraft carriers. A lot of them are from the 70s or 80s and are approaching the end of their lifespan. And so when we are not able to build ships fast enough as a result of the lack of private shipbuilding industry, that then affects the size of our Navy. China has surpassed us in terms of number of ships. Obviously, we still dominate them in terms of tonnage, the weight, but in a naval war, I'm not sure tonnage will matter a lot if China can outnumber our ships like 3-1.
Well, one thing that we could do to remedy that while not nationalizing is providing more market incentive to like private dockyards and shipmaking. But also, well, yeah, if the government is looking for places to build new ships and they're offering enough money, then there will be people there to build the ship, because that's how supply and demand works. Of course, if there is limited space to build the ship, then more will have to be made. But then we could use that space for future projects. And I'm not sure where nationalizing is really in your argument here.
Well, I'm saying that corporations kind of have less of an incentive to build ships given the cost of actually producing them and then building more dockyards and so on and so on. And so what I'm saying is that if the government were to take over the role of production, not necessarily design, but production, then the government would be able to it has a more vested interest in building dockyards than a corporation does. I mean, obviously, if the government is paying enough, then they'll care more, but the government does not really need monetary incentive to want to build a dockyard to make a new warship if it is starting to run low on warships. Do you get what I'm saying?
Kinda, but it's also that, like, you don't. Like, for companies that make dockyards, it's just construction companies. And we have plenty of those. So, like, those would absolutely take up the opportunity. And then once those are done, then we could get a lot of. Then we would. And, like, the incentive would create more shipmakers or more people to get into the shipmaker business to, like, help the small number that's already there. And the same thing will come about, maybe even a little better because of, like, government inefficiency, bureaucracy getting in the way, and stuff like that.
What I'm basically trying to say is that we are held hostage by a monopoly of defense contractors, and the ability to produce replacement parts or to produce replacement bullets or missiles or what have you that is entirely in the hands, basically now, of the military-industrial complex, basically meaning they can charge whatever they want, and given that they know that we have virtually no other source to go to for it aside from them, either by way of lack of competition or a clause within a contract, basically they basically own the US military. They basically have it held hostage. The most powerful military in the world is being held hostage by 5 corporations which control the spare parts and the ammunition production of our entire military apparatus. And without ammunition or spare parts, the military would basically come to a screeching halt, and this is not a scenario which will have good effects for the United States, especially if we get into a drawn-out conflict with China, which has nationalized its own defense industry. And we have seen a rapid growth of Chinese military size over the last decade, which I think we need to be kind of contemplating whether our system that we currently have when it comes to our defense industry is up to the task of possibly fighting against a country like China, which has dedicated vast amounts of resources to its military buildup. And I mean, obviously, I'm not advocating we become a country like China, but what I am saying is that their system, at least in terms of production, has worked. I mean, obviously, they have stolen a great deal of technology specs from us, but in terms of production and cranking out equipment, they have us beat, kind of. Which is why I'm saying that we should maintain the privatization of the design element of the military. But when it comes to the actual production, the making of tanks, the making of rifles, the making of missiles, that should fall more under the scope of the government, more under the scope of the private sector. It may have worked in World War II, but back then the military-industrial complex did not wield the vast amount of influence and control and monopoly that it does now. So what worked in World War II most likely will not work for the next war, especially as the equipment is getting much more advanced and it's getting slightly more complicated to produce. We need to make sure that we can produce it as fast as possible and that it is not being held up by contract negotiations and it's not being held up by failure to send the necessary funds to Raytheon to get a spare part, which would allow a tank to move. That is basically what I'm saying.
Well, that problem could also be solved by trust busting and breaking up those monopolies.
Right. No, that could definitely be another viable option. But I think the main idea of this is that the current system does not work and will not benefit us down the road, especially as conflicts and tensions increase and as the demand for more advanced weaponry increases, which we need a solution to. The solution I have proposed is nationalization. The solution you have proposed is basically trust busting and keeping it in the public sector. Or private sector, not public sector. All right. Thank you for listening to Simplifying the State. We will be back next week with our next episode. Make sure to rate the podcast if you enjoy it. Make sure to follow to be notified whenever a new episode comes out. Whether you're watching this on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever, just make sure you subscribe or follow. And then we will see you next time.